Former Lia Thomas opponents share abuse, push Georgia lawmakers to pass trans athlete in women's sports ban. A Georgia State Senate committee passed the Fair and Safe Athletic Opportunities Act on Thursday following testimony from multiple female athletes who have competed against transgender athletes. The bill would require student athletes to compete on teams that align with their biological sex at birth. If signed into law, Georgia would become the 26th state to enact such restrictions. The debate over transgender participation in women's sports has been especially prominent in Georgia since the state hosted the 2022 NCAA Women's Swimming Championships, where transgender swimmer Lia Thomas competed and won the 500-meter freestyle. Athletes shared testimonies of discomfort, unequal competition. Several former NCAA swimmers, including Kylie Alons, Caitlin Wheeler, and Paula Scanlon, testified about their experiences competing against and sharing locker rooms with Thomas. "We were guinea pigs for a social experiment," said Alons, a former North Carolina State swimmer and two-time NCAA champion. She described watching women lose opportunities and said she felt deep sadness seeing Thomas win a championship title. Wheeler, a former University of Kentucky swimmer, recalled the discomfort she felt changing in a locker room shared with Thomas. "Young women, teenage girls were forced to undress next to a fully intact biological male who exposed himself to us," she said. Lyons, another former athlete, said she was so uncomfortable that she chose to change in a storage closet rather than use the team locker room. Wheeler and Lyons are both plaintiffs in a lawsuit against the NCAA, joined by former NCAA swimmer Riley Gaines, who has been vocal in advocating for restrictions on transgender athletes in women's sports. Opposition and concerns for transgender athletes. The bill has drawn opposition from civil rights groups, medical professionals, and LGBTQ+ advocates, who argue it unfairly targets transgender youth. Dr. Jody Greenwald, a pediatrician from Roswell, cautioned lawmakers against framing transgender athletes as threats. "Transgender girls are not predators," she said, emphasizing that transgender youth face higher risks of depression and suicide. Despite the opposition, the bill passed with an 8-3 vote after a nearly 2-hour debate. Political responses and broader implications. Lieutenant Governor Bill Jones hailed the vote as a step toward protecting fairness in women's sports. "Biological men do not belong in women's sports, period," Jones said. "This is common sense to everyone except the most radical liberals." Meanwhile, a federal ban on transgender athletes in girls' and women's sports is also progressing through Congress. The Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act, which would cut federal funding for schools allowing transgender participation in women's sports, passed the U.S. House of Representatives in January with full Republican support and opposition from most Democrats. A recent New York Times, Ipsos poll found that 79% of Americans believe biological males should not be allowed to compete in women's sports, including 67% of Democrats surveyed. With the bill now heading to the full Georgia Senate, the debate over transgender participation in sports continues to fuel discussions on fairness, inclusion, and the future of women's athletics.